husband is on the floor. He's not moving.
Can you tell me the address? What happened?
He came at me. I tried to get away. I hit him.
Stay where you are. Officers are on the way.
Police arrive within minutes. Inside, a man lies motionless at the base of the stairs. But the house itself tells another story. Look closer at the street outside. Security cameras from nearby homes show the same address appearing again and again. Different days. Different times. Police cars pulling up to the curb. Officers walking to the door. Sometimes late at night. Sometimes just before dawn. Each time, the outcome is the same. No arrest. No charges. No statement filed. In several clips, both of them are visible on the porch. He speaks. She stands slightly behind him. Her posture is still. Her eyes never look toward the officers for long. The calls were logged. The visits recorded. But every incident ended the same way. She declined to press charges. At the time, these visits were treated as routine domestic disturbances. Only later would investigators realize they were not isolated moments. They were warnings, captured on camera, long before the final call was ever made. When Avriti Malgaonkar entered Canada as the sponsored spouse of Kunal Deshpande, her case appeared routine. The marriage had been legally registered in India. The spousal sponsorship application was submitted correctly, supported by identity documents, affidavits, and financial disclosures. There were no discrepancies flagged by immigration authorities. Kunal, a Canadian citizen of Indian origin, had permanent employment history, stable residence, and no prior sponsorship violations. From an administrative standpoint, the case fit a standard profile seen regularly by immigration officers. Upon arrival, Avriti moved directly into Kunal's detached home in a suburban Ontario neighborhood. The area was quiet and uniform, composed of similar houses, each set back from the road with long driveways and maintained lawns. There was little street activity and limited interaction between neighbors. The environment did not suggest instability or risk. To outsiders, the household appeared orderly and private. In the initial weeks, daily life followed a narrow routine. Kunal left the house early each morning for work. Avriti remained inside for most of the day. She was not enrolled in language classes yet and had not received authorization to work. She did not drive and had no access to a vehicle. Financially, she depended entirely on Kunal. She did not hold a Canadian bank account, and personal expenses were handled through him. All immigration-related correspondence was directed to Kunal's email address. Physical documents were kept in a locked cabinet inside the house. When asked, Kunal explained that immigration processes were sensitive and that mistakes or miscommunication could jeopardize the application. He positioned himself as the necessary intermediary between Avriti and the system. She did not challenge this arrangement. At that stage, she viewed it as practical and temporary. Contact with her family in India was limited. Phone calls were short and increasingly infrequent. There were no extended conversations about her daily life. According to later statements, she avoided discussing details because she did not want to cause concern. Her communication pattern did not raise alarms externally, but it reflected growing isolation. Within the household, decision-making authority was centralized. Kunal controlled scheduling, finances, correspondence, and external interaction. This structure was not presented as coercive. It was framed as guidance during an adjustment period. Avriti was repeatedly told that once her immigration status progressed, independence would follow. This framing reduced resistance and normalized dependence. There were no immediate signs of conflict visible to neighbors or acquaintances. The couple did not host guests. They did not participate in community events. Their absence from social spaces went largely unnoticed. In a setting where privacy was common, isolation did not stand out. What was not visible at this stage was how fixed the imbalance already was. Avriti had no independent access to official information about her status. She lacked familiarity with Canadian systems and relied entirely on Kunal's explanations. The structure of sponsorship placed him in a position of authority that extended beyond the legal framework and into daily life. From the outside, the situation resembled a cautious new marriage adapting to immigration logistics. Inside the house, however, dependence was not transitional. It was embedded from the start. Control was exercised through procedure rather than force. Restrictions were introduced as necessities rather than rules. By the end of the first month, Avridi's world had narrowed to the interior of the house and the information Kunal chose to provide. At that point, no complaints had been made, no authorities contacted, and no incidents recorded. There was no single moment that marked a shift. The arrangement settled quietly into place, establishing conditions that would later become critical. The shift in the household did not happen suddenly. It developed through repeated, minor corrections that gradually reshaped daily behavior. Kunal began correcting Avridi's speech, her volume, her timing, and the way she interacted with others. He commented on how she spoke to delivery drivers, how long she stood at the door, and whether her tone sounded appropriate. These corrections were framed as guidance, not discipline. Over time, they became constant. When Avridi suggested leaving the house alone, even for short walks, Kunal discouraged it. He cited safety concerns and warned her that misunderstandings were common for newcomers. He told her neighbors might misinterpret her understandings or that police attention could complicate immigration matters. These warnings were presented as concern, but the effect was restriction. Her movement became limited without any explicit rule being stated. Phone use became another point of control. Kunal did not confiscate her phone or openly forbid calls. Instead, he monitored activity through questions. Who did you speak to? Why did you need to call? What did you say? These questions were asked casually, but consistently. Over time, Avridi reduced communication on her own to avoid interrogation. Immigration information continued to be filtered. When emails arrived, Kunal read them privately and summarized the contents. He told her what was important and what was not. Documents were not shared. Access remained centralized. When she asked to see correspondence directly, he responded that too many people made mistakes by interfering with the process. He reminded her that one wrong move could jeopardize everything. Arguments followed a predictable pattern. When Avridi questioned why decisions were made without her, Kunal redirected the discussion toward sponsorship. He reminded her that her presence in Canada depended on his cooperation. The implication was clear even when not stated directly. The power imbalance was tied to legal status, not personal preference. The first police visit occurred late at night. A neighbor reported raised voices coming from the house. Officers arrived and spoke briefly with both individuals. No visible injuries were observed. No complaint was filed. The interaction ended without action. This pattern repeated in the following months. Police were called several more times by neighbors. Each visit followed the same sequence. Officers arrived. Kunal spoke first. He remained calm and controlled. Avridi stood slightly behind him and did not step forward. When asked if she wanted to make a statement, she declined. No charges were laid. The calls were logged as domestic disturbances without further follow-up. Inside the house, the environment continued to change. During arguments, Kunal positioned himself between Avridi and exits. Doors were blocked, not locked, but physically occupied. Objects were thrown during disputes, not at her, but near enough to communicate threat. These actions stopped short of direct assault but altered the dynamic of the space. Movement became constrained during conflict. Language also changed. Kunal began using immigration terminology during arguments. Words like withdrawal, revocation, and consequences entered everyday disputes. These were not formal threats. They were reminders. The message did not need repetition to be understood. As winter approached, Avridi's external contact diminished further. She stopped discussing her life with family and friends. Conversations became limited to neutral updates. She avoided describing conditions inside the house. Isolation was no longer incidental. It was enforced through routine, monitoring, and the anticipation of conflict. At this stage, there were still no formal complaints, no reports of physical violence, and no documented injuries. To authorities, the incidents a period of control were not visible. Each event, taken alone, appeared minor. Together, they formed a pattern. By the end of the winter, Avridi's daily life was defined by restriction, surveillance, and dependence. The situation had stabilized into a closed system, with no external intervention and no clear exit. The situation escalated when Avridi encountered information that directly contradicted what she had been told about her immigration status. While cleaning the house, she found an unopened letter addressed to Kunal from immigration authorities. The document stated that the spousal sponsorship application had not progressed beyond an early stage. Several required documents had never been submitted. The file had effectively stalled months earlier. When Avridi confronted Kunal with the letter, his response was immediate and dismissive. He claimed delays were common and accused her of interfering in matters she did not understand. Within minutes, the conversation shifted from explanation to accusation. He told her she was being ungrateful and suggested she was deliberately looking for reasons to cause problems. He implied she intended to leave him once her status was secured. Following this discovery, Kunal's behavior became less controlled. He began monitoring Avridi's movements inside the house. Certain rooms were closed off without explanation. During disagreements, he positioned himself in doorways, limiting her ability to move freely. He questioned her intentions repeatedly and accused her of planning an exit strategy. Arguments increased in frequency and intensity. Raised voices became common. Objects were knocked over or thrown during disputes, not directly at her but close enough to establish dominance. The tone of interactions shifted from corrective to confrontational. Kunal began repeating statements linking her future in Canada to his cooperation. The implication was consistent even when phrasing varied. During one confrontation, Kunal grabbed Avridi's arm as she attempted to move past him. The grip was forceful enough to leave visible bruising. After the incident, Avridi photographed the marks on her phone. She kept the images briefly, then deleted them. According to later statements, she was unsure what such evidence would accomplish and feared retaliation if discovered. Another police visit occurred shortly after, triggered by neighbors who heard shouting in the early morning hours. Officers arrived, spoke with both individuals, and again observed no immediate signs of injury. Avridi declined to file a complaint. No charges were laid. The call was logged and closed. Later that morning, Kunal warned her that police records alone could create problems for her immigration case. He told her that repeated attention, even without charges, could raise concerns. The message reinforced an existing fear: involvement with authorities carried consequences beyond the immediate situation. After this incident, Avridi began documenting events privately. She kept notes recording dates, phrases used during arguments, and references to immigration threats. The documentation was not intended for immediate use. It was a personal record, kept hidden. At this stage, she did not view it as preparation for leaving. She viewed it as a way to maintain clarity in a situation that felt increasingly unstable. By this point, Avridi no longer believed that leaving the house was a realistic option. She did not attempt to contact legal aid, shelters, or immigration services independently. Her focus shifted from resolution to avoidance. She adjusted her behavior to reduce conflict, limiting questions, minimizing movement, and staying within defined boundaries. The house functioned as a closed system. Information flowed in one direction. Authority was not negotiated. Each unresolved conflict increased tension rather than resolving it. The atmosphere no longer fluctuated between calm and dispute. It remained consistently strained. By early spring, the situation had stabilized into a state of constant pressure. There were no dramatic incidents, but no relief. The lack of escalation was not the result of improvement. It reflected exhaustion and containment. Both individuals continued daily routines, but the underlying conflict remained unresolved, building quietly toward an outcome that neither explicitly discussed but both appeared to anticipate. The final confrontation escalated from a dispute into an immediate threat to Avridi's life. It began with paperwork, but it did not remain verbal. When Avridi confronted Kunal about the stalled sponsorship and missing documents, the exchange intensified rapidly. According to later reconstruction, his response shifted from denial to aggression within moments. As the argument moved away from the kitchen toward the stairwell, Kunal closed the distance between them. Avridi attempted to step past him, but he blocked her path. The space near the stairs was narrow, limiting movement and eliminating a clear exit. Investigators later determined that this positioning was deliberate and consistent with prior incidents in which he had restricted her ability to leave during disputes. The confrontation turned physical when Kunal placed his hands around Avridi's neck. Forensic analysis later documented injuries to her neck consistent with manual strangulation. These included redness, bruising, and patterned marks corresponding to finger placement. Medical experts would later testify that such injuries indicate a high-risk event, capable of causing loss of consciousness or death within seconds. As the pressure increased, Avridi raised her hands instinctively to protect her airway. There was no opportunity to retreat. The stairwell limited backward movement, and Kunal's body blocked lateral escape. Witness audio later described raised voices followed by a sudden interruption, consistent with airway restriction. Near the base of the stairs stood a console table holding a heavy decorative statuette. As the strangulation continued, Avridi reached toward the table. Investigators later concluded that this movement was not preparatory or calculated. It occurred while her airway was being restricted and her balance compromised. Avridi grasped the statuette with one hand while using the other to break contact at her neck. In a single motion, she swung the object once toward Kunal's head. The strike was delivered at close range. Experts later described the movement as reactive and defensive, consistent with an attempt to stop ongoing strangulation rather than to inflict harm. The impact caused Kunal to release his grip immediately. He collapsed backward at the base of the stairs. The fall ended the assault. There was no further contact between them. Avridi did not strike again. The physical scene supported this sequence. Blood pattern analysis identified a single point of impact. There were no injuries suggesting repeated blows. There were no signs of pursuit or continued violence after Kunal fell. Furniture outside the immediate stairwell area remained undisturbed. After the collapse, Avridi stepped back and remained where she was. She did not attempt to flee. She did not attempt to move Kunal or alter the scene. Phone records later confirmed that she called emergency services within minutes of the incident. The timing of the call indicated no delay intended to conceal events or avoid responsibility. When paramedics arrived, Kunal was unresponsive. Resuscitation efforts were unsuccessful. Police officers entering the home observed no forced entry and no signs of staging. The statuette was found on the floor near the base of the stairs, consistent with it being dropped immediately after the strike. Officers documented visible injuries on Avridi's neck and arms. These injuries were photographed and logged at the scene. At that time, no conclusions were drawn publicly about their significance. Avridi was cooperative and followed instructions. She did not offer a detailed statement at the scene beyond acknowledging that an argument had occurred and that she had called for help as soon as she could breathe safely. Based on the outcome alone, the incident was classified as a domestic homicide pending investigation. A man was dead inside his home. His spouse was present and had delivered the fatal blow. The object involved was clearly identified. However, even in the initial assessment, several factors complicated that classification. The presence of neck injuries consistent with strangulation, the confined location, the blocked exit, and the single defensive strike all indicated that the violence had not originated with the blow itself. The scene captured only the final seconds of a longer escalation. It did not explain the sustained pressure on Avridi's neck, the loss of air, or the absence of alternatives in that moment. Those details would become central as investigators moved beyond the stairwell and began to assess whether the force used was excessive or whether it was the only action available to stop an immediate, potentially fatal threat. After the scene was secured, the investigation moved into its analytical phase. The physical evidence collected at the house was reviewed alongside medical findings and prior police records. At this stage, the focus shifted from the immediate outcome to the sequence of events that led to it. Forensic examination confirmed that Kunal died from a single blunt force injury to the head. There were no secondary injuries indicating repeated blows. No defensive wounds were found on his arms or hands. The injury pattern was consistent with one impact delivered at close range. Blood pattern analysis supported this conclusion. There was no evidence of movement or further contact after the strike. Medical documentation of Avridi's injuries became central to the case. Photographs taken at the scene and later at the hospital showed clear signs of manual strangulation. Bruising and redness were present on both sides of her neck, with visible finger pattern marks. Medical experts advised investigators that these injuries were not superficial. Manual strangulation is classified as a high-risk assault and can cause loss of consciousness or death within seconds. The injuries were consistent with sustained pressure, not incidental contact. Investigators compared the injury timelines. The marks on Avridi's neck were fresh and aligned with the estimated time of the fatal incident. There was no medical evidence suggesting they occurred earlier or were self-inflicted. This directly contradicted any theory that the physical violence began with the use of the statuette. Attention then turned to prior police interactions with the household. Records showed multiple calls for domestic disturbances at the same address over several months. None had resulted in charges. In each instance, officers documented raised voices but no visible injuries and no statements filed. These reports had been closed individually without escalation. Investigators reviewed body camera footage and officer notes from those prior visits. The pattern was consistent. Kunal spoke to police. Avridi remained silent and physically positioned behind him. She declined to make statements each time. There was no record of her ever initiating contact with police. This pattern took on new significance in light of the strangulation evidence. Investigators noted that victims experiencing coercive control often avoid formal complaints due to fear of retaliation or other consequences. In this case, that fear was compounded by immigration dependency. Investigators also examined immigration records. They confirmed that Avridi's spousal sponsorship application had not progressed as she had been led to believe. Required documents had not been submitted on time. The application was effectively stalled. This information supported the conclusion that her legal status remained uncertain at the time of the incident. Statements recovered from digital devices showed repeated references by Kunal to sponsorship withdrawal and immigration consequences during arguments. While not explicit threats of violence, these statements reinforced control and dependency. Investigators categorized this behavior as coercive control rather than isolated verbal conflict. The sequence of the final confrontation was reconstructed using forensic data, medical findings, and scene analysis. Investigators concluded that Kunal initiated physical violence by applying pressure to Avridi's neck while blocking her exit near the stairwell. The use of strangulation placed her at immediate risk of serious injury or death. The use of the statuette occurred during the assault and stopped once the threat ended. Crucially, investigators found no evidence that Avridi continued to use force after Kunal released his grip and collapsed. There was no delay in contacting emergency services. There was no attempt to flee, conceal evidence, or alter the scene. These factors weighed heavily in the assessment. By the end of this phase, the investigation had shifted direction. The fatal injury was no longer viewed in isolation. It was evaluated as part of a sequence in which Avridi faced an immediate and life-threatening assault, had no clear path of escape, and used force once to stop the attack. The question before prosecutors was no longer whether she caused Kunal's death. That fact was undisputed. The question was whether her actions met the legal threshold for self-defense under Canadian law. That determination would now move from investigators to the courtroom. The case proceeded to court after prosecutors completed their review of the evidence. The charge was manslaughter. The Crown did not allege premeditation. The central issue was whether Avridi's use of force exceeded what was reasonable in the circumstances. At trial, the facts of the fatal injury were not disputed. It was established that Avridi delivered the blow that caused Kunal's death. The prosecution focused on the outcome rather than the context, arguing that the use of a heavy object resulted in a fatal injury and therefore constituted unlawful force. The Crown acknowledged the presence of conflict in the relationship but questioned whether lethal force was necessary. The defense centered its case on self-defense under Canadian law. Medical experts testified regarding Avridi's neck injuries. Photographs and medical records showed bruising and finger pattern marks consistent with manual strangulation. The experts explained that strangulation is a high-risk assault capable of causing loss of consciousness or death within seconds. They emphasized that victims often have no time to calculate proportional responses once airway restriction begins. Forensic specialists testified that Kunal's injuries were consistent with a single impact. There was no evidence of repeated blows, no pursuit, and no contact after he collapsed. Blood pattern analysis confirmed a single point of impact. The statuette was not used again once the threat stopped. These findings supported the conclusion that force ceased immediately when the danger ended. Police officers testified about the scene. They described the absence of forced entry, the contained nature of the incident, and Avridi's immediate call for help. They also confirmed that she did not attempt to flee or alter the scene and complied fully with instructions. Prior police records were introduced to establish context. Officers confirmed multiple previous calls to the residence for domestic disturbances. While none resulted in charges, the records showed a pattern of escalating conflict. Body camera footage from earlier visits showed Kunal speaking with police while Avridi remained silent behind him. The court accepted this as relevant background, not as proof of prior crimes, but as evidence of an ongoing dynamic. Immigration records were also reviewed. Officials confirmed that Avridi's spousal sponsorship had stalled and that her legal status remained uncertain at the time of the incident. The defense argued that this dependency contributed to her vulnerability and reluctance to seek help. The court accepted that immigration status can be a factor in assessing the reasonableness of perceived threat. Avridi did not testify extensively. Her statements to police and medical personnel were entered into evidence. She consistently stated that she acted to stop the assault and called for help as soon as she could breathe safely. There were no inconsistencies identified in her account. In closing arguments, the defense emphasized immediacy. The use of force occurred while Avridi was being strangled, her exit blocked, and her airway restricted. The defense argued that the law does not require a person to measure force with precision when facing a life-threatening assault. The judge's ruling focused on 3 points: imminence, proportionality, and intent. The court found that Avridi faced an immediate and serious threat to her life. The use of force was reactive and ceased once the threat ended. There was no evidence of intent to kill. The court concluded that the Crown had not disproven self-defense beyond a reasonable doubt. Avridi was acquitted. Following the verdict, the court addressed ancillary matters. Immigration authorities reviewed Avridi's status separately from the criminal case. Based on humanitarian considerations and the circumstances established at trial, she was permitted to remain in Canada. There was no civil settlement and no public statement from either family. The house was later sold. The neighborhood returned to routine. The case was recorded as an example of how outcomes alone do not define criminal responsibility. The judgment emphasized that self-defense must be assessed in real time, not in hindsight, and that survival decisions made under immediate threat cannot be evaluated as calculated acts. The legal process ended with acquittal. The consequences of the events, however, extended beyond the courtroom, marking the conclusion of a case where the law determined that a death occurred, but a crime did not.